Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Franco, your host of Frank Analysis, and I'm joined today by Ray McGovern, who is a former CIA analyst. He served the community for 27 years, from the John F. Kennedy administration to that of George H.W. Bush. In 2003, he co-founded Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPS, to expose how U.S. intelligence used falsified information to justify the war in Iraq. And he is also a contributor of journal outlets like Consortium News, RT, and Sputnik News. So it's great to have you on here, Ray. It's truly an honor. How are you?
Thanks, Franco. Thanks for inviting. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you okay.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I just want to let the audience know, please share this out to people, especially those that are not as informed about these topics, people who tend to disagree with you, friends and family, so that we can help spread awareness about what's actually happening. So, since you were involved in spreading awareness of the unjustified invasion of Iraq, I wanted to start out by also showing you this clip here of George W. Bush letting slip, or having a Freudian slip here, saying he was denouncing Vladimir Putin for launching a wholly unjustified invasion of Ukraine, but he said Iraq instead of Ukraine, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this real quick.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq. Anyway, 75.
So I wanted to start out by getting your thoughts on that, and then we'll talk more about Turkey, Ukraine, and everything. What do you think?
Franco, no words to describe that. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people killed. We're talking about 5,000 Americans killed. When I first saw that, my question was, well, was that deliberate?
Right.
What did he say right after he made the so-called gaffe? Did you understand that?
He said
What he
75.
said, yeah, what does that mean?
I'm not sure what that means, but the audience laughed about it. And they must know how that was an unjustified war in Iraq after everything that was revealed since. But why did they laugh like that? Right?
This is really hard. Americans are better than to laugh at a whole bunch of people being killed in an unnecessary war. Now, I guess that was at the Bush Center, Bush Library, or whatever it is. I guess it was in Dallas. I'm not sure of that, but I suppose the audience was made up of people that would have cheered that kind of thing on. And, George W. Bush should be in prison.
Right.
His friend Tony Blair should be in prison. They're obviously guilty of war crimes. And here he is given a position to make a little speech. I was wondering if he seemed a little drunk to me.
Yeah.
He didn't seem to be the eloquent cheerleader that he used to be. But whatever he is, there is such a thing as evil in the world. And I don't like to call people evil, but people do evil things. And Bush and Cheney, who I believe is still alive, and others like Rumsfeld. Well, Rumsfeld's dead. I just don't know my first impulse was go to Dallas and get some friends around and do a citizen's arrest, because here he is laughing about war crimes. What could be worse than that? The key, Franco, is that no one was held accountable for that unnecessary war. Torture, all the things that go with a war of aggression. After Nuremberg, there was a specific definition given to a war of aggression. Uh, to make a war of aggression is to commit the supreme international crime, a crime that includes within it all the other crimes that go with a war: torture, all kinds of other abuses. So here is a guy who's living in a lap of luxury, surrounded by guards that would protect him from the likes of you and me, and he's making fun of having started a war. Now, in those days, they started calling this war a war of choice. But what the hell is a war of choice? I mean, there didn't used to be wars of choice, except the ones that were waged by people like Hitler. So here's a war of choice. Now, he's accusing Mr. Putin of acting in this same way that he sort of admits, in a Freudian slip sort of way, that he did. But the comparison is not very favorable. Um, Putin, it can be argued, was not making a capricious decision to do a war of choice. Bush was. Iraq was no threat to the United States. Bush knew it. If his own intelligence people didn't tell him, we told him. And after a couple of years, when the Senate completed their exhaustive study, a 5-year study, their bipartisan results said that this war was based on intelligence, and intelligence that was contradicted, uncollaborated, and even non-existent. Their words. Now, what does non-existent intelligence look like? It was manufactured. And my great regret is that my former colleagues participated in that war crime. Mm-hmm. The media was accessory to the crime. The media just regurgitated what the government said, as they are doing now on Ukraine. And the media should be held accountable, but they weren't. Now, here's an example. The fellow who was heading the op-ed section of the Washington Post, his name is Fred Hyatt. And I'm going to give myself an exemption from speaking ill of the dead. He died about half a year ago. When he was up at the Columbia School of Journalism, pretty well-regarded place, he did an interview after the war, and they said, Mr. Hyatt, you kept saying on your editorial page, or kept regurgitating what others were saying, that the weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq. And you described that as flat fact. They were in Iraq. They were in Iraq. Now, they weren't. What do you say now, Mr. Hyatt? He thought for a second. He said, well, if there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, we probably shouldn't have said that there were. Now, my mentor, a fellow named Bob Perry, he commented after that. He's a wonderful journalist, died about 4 years ago. He said, Ray, that's sort of like a cardinal rule of journalism. If something's not true, you're not supposed to say that it is. Hello? So it's a very dismal situation, Franco, where you have not only the press gets away with this, not only the criminals like Bush and Cheney, but people laugh. And that makes me very sad and makes me think that these same people will be susceptible to the kinds of propaganda that will get us in a war with Russia over
Yeah.
Ukraine. That's crazy because that's not a war of choice for us. It's
Yeah.
not a war of choice for Russia. It's a existential threat. In other words, Russia's not going to be able to lose this, and they have the power and the short of the use of nuclear weapons, they have the wherewithal to prevail. And the sooner the U.S. realizes that if they back Putin up against the wall, first thing he'll do is call his big brother China into the fray. And if China, for whatever reason, is reluctant, then he's got nuclear weapons. Would he use them? Well, the intelligence people say those are the conditions under which he might use them. For what?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
why are we there? Well, because people lie and because the press regurgitates everything they say.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So to answer the question earlier that you had about what he said after that, he said the number 75. Someone in the chat pointed out that means 75 years old, the age that he is. So it was a not all there joke, saying that, oh, sorry, I'm not all there, but
Yeah.
still, it's a Freudian slip that he just let out there. Wholly
Well,
unjustified war, right?
yeah, I guess everybody's calling it a Freudian slip. Uh, I guess it is. I mean, the guy is capable of doing that kind of thing for jokes.
Mm,
Okay, I think it's
I
possible,
don't doubt it.
given the guy that he did it deliberately. Remember when he was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner late in his second term, and he's looking around for weapons of mass destruction, and he's looking at his cubby holes. Oh, not there. Whoop!
Oh my gosh.
No weapons. And the press and the correspondents are all laughing their asses off. I mean, give me a break, Franco. We gotta. Why don't you join me? We'll go down to Dallas, and I know where he lives. I've been right on his lawn before the Secret Service chased me away after he stopped being president. He's a well. Let me put it this way. I talked at a Lutheran church in Dallas in his neighborhood about 2 years after he left office. And I said, I think maybe you ought to think about what you say to George Bush when you meet him in the supermarket. And they looked at me and said, what do you mean? I said, the guy's a war criminal. Oh,
Right.
no, 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 no. So, how are people to know what's going on if the press witnessed Fred Hyatt? Now, by the way, Fred Hyatt was so wrong in Iraq. That was 2002, 2003. He didn't die until last year. Of course, they dismissed him from the op ed editorship of the Washington Post, right? No. He stayed there for well, the next 19 years. So that's what kind of respect the mainstream press is due, namely zero respect. And that's why it's good. That's why when someone like you, Franco, invites me on to talk, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, and again, I would like to thank you for coming on. Someone with an experience like yours is a valuable voice to have on here, especially when regards to what's happening right now, how we could be sleepwalking into World War III, and how Sweden and Finland potentially joining NATO could be a step forward for that. Now, Turkey was the only country part of NATO that did not want this to happen. They need to have a full-on agreement with all NATO members in order to accept a new membership. And now the reasoning that they gave is that Sweden and Finland harbor what they called terrorists, that they support terrorists, they let them come to their country. They're talking about members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party or the PKK. But regardless of that, Finland and Sweden still apply to join NATO amid Turkish objections. And following that, Turkey met with Antony Blinken. And after that meeting, it looks like Turkey is giving some mixed signals. Maybe they're going to get something out of this. But what would this mean, and where do you see this going, Ree?
Well, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, is a pretty clever, if mercurial, kind of fellow. Now, when the Turks last faced into a decision like this, it was 2003, early on, January, February. What the Pentagon, our Pentagon, of course, wanted to do was to invade Iraq on a couple of axes, one of which would come down from the north through Turkey. It would have made it even easier for us, okay? And the Turks said, nothing doing. We're not gonna let you. And Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of State, was appalled. He said, "You Turks do what we tell you. I mean, hello, this is war, for God's sake." And the Turks thumbed their nose and said, "No, we're not going to do it." Now, the shock wore off Wolfowitz, and shock and awe, of course, was introduced in Baghdad and the south. And, of course, the U.S. Outmatched the Iraqi forces. But in that instance, it's helpful to remember that the Turks faced into saying no to a member of NATO, the U.S., and Tony Blair of Britain. So what are they going to do this time? Well, a lot of people think that Erdogan is really so ticked off at the U.S. for its tacit support of Greece and militarizing some of those Aegean islands and taking Greece's case in many disputes that Greece has with Turkey, that Erdogan is so ticked off about that, and a little bit ticked off about all these Kurdish, what he calls terrorists in Sweden and Finland, that he will act like the Turks did. He was the head of that party in those days, so he played a role in that. I don't know. I'm not an expert on Turkey. My guess, for what it's worth, is that Erdogan will extract concessions from NATO, from the United States, such that they'll let their arms be twisted and won't really object when push comes to shove. That's just speculation on my part. I'm not an expert on Turkey. But you're right in stressing, Franco, that there are 30 members of NATO now. There are others that are sort of lukewarm about the notion that the Finnish border, which is over 800 miles long, the Finnish border with Russia, would be a new part of NATO's confrontation with Russia. So whether others like, there are Croatia, Slovenia, some other lesser nations would object. 30 is required. My guess is that they'll bow down before the U.S. In the final analysis. The more important thing, of course, is how the Russians will react. Now, they already have a very long border with Ukraine. We know how they have reacted to what they consider to be a national threat there, a existential threat. Now, let me just try to explain in layman's terms what I mean by an existential threat. If you have missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and they are in position in countries like Poland, countries like Romania, countries like Ukraine, that's an existential threat, because that gives Putin 5 to 7 minutes to decide whether he's under a nuclear attack and whether he should destroy the rest of the world. I'm not exaggerating, for God's sake. Now, so you're Putin. Would you like to have a little bit more than 5 to 7 minutes to decide that? Now, I'm talking launch to target. Now, Putin's not going to be able to react. They will have to automate their systems. they would have to put it on automatic. And so you will have a lieutenant colonel in the Russian rocket forces seeing something go up from around Finland or Norway and say, "Oh my God, I think this is the real thing." He pushes the
Hmm.
button. There's no time to consult Putin, and that's the way, that's incredibly dangerous, incredibly delicate. And I sympathize with Putin. If I were Putin, I would like to have a little bit more than 5 to 7 minutes. Now, am I talking theoretically? No, I'm talking realistically. Putin made it clear 7 years ago, and I have the tape, made it clear in a talk with Western journalists, where he explained, look, there are missile sites going into Poland and Romania that you all in the West are calling anti-ballistic missile sites. That is, they're going to shoot down missiles that are headed our way. Uh, who's going to shoot those missiles? Um, you say it's going to be Iran. We already handcuffed Iran. They can't do anything for the next 5 to 10 years, and we don't really have any intelligence information that Iran either has a missile that can go that far or a nuclear warhead to put on it. So, are you telling us the truth? No, no, we think it's Iran, but they're not going to do it. Well, yeah, but they could do it a little bit later. Well, then Putin says, "Look, we know the plan, that Pentagon plan here. You say anti-ballistic missiles. The the installation can accommodate Tomahawk." He says,
Hmm.
uh, there's no H in Russian, so it's Tomahawk missiles, okay, cruise missiles that could destroy the ICBM fleet in the western part or the northern part of Russia. So we know that the Pentagon plans to make these silos or holes in the ground, whatever you call them, able to accommodate such missiles. And later, not only tomahawks, but also hypersonic, hypersonic missiles. Then we only have 4 to 5 minutes to decide, okay? Now, the installation is completed in Romania already. It's just about to be finished in Poland. Um, Now, what do we think about that? We know that if you take a little disk and you put it in the computer that regulates the firing of this missile, you can change it from a ABM anti-ballistic missile into a Tomahawk or a hypersonic missile overnight. We have no way of finding out what kind of missile is going off there. We don't want that. And that's why we don't want that in Ukraine, and that's why we're really really serious about that kind of threat in our neighborhood. Now, if Americans need a frame of reference to compare this to, let me adduce a really good example. It's an analogy that's very apt in this situation. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, most of this audience would be too young to remember that, but I remember it. I was on active duty with the U.S. Army, Army Intelligence, Combat Intelligence, Infantry. And when I went down to Fort Benning, there were no weapons there. Fort Benning is the Army Infantry Training School. There's supposed to be weapons there to train on. Where were they? They were all in Florida, Key West, ready to go into Cuba. That's how close we were. The generals wanted to nuke the Soviet Union, and when Kennedy asked them, well, how many Americans would suffer? There are only about 20 million. I mean, hello, these guys were crazy, okay? Now, what did Kennedy do? When Khrushchev shipped nuclear missiles to Cuba and emplaced them in some parts of Cuba, that was considered to be an existential threat to the United States. What does that mean? Well, these things could take out our naval ports like Norfolk. They could wreak havoc in the United States with how much warning? Probably 7 to 8 minutes. Okay, so Kennedy said, "No, you can't do that. You're not going to do that." So that was an existential threat.
Mm-hmm.
What happened? Well, he negotiated with Khrushchev. He told the generals to go in another room, and he talked with his diplomats, one of whom was Llewellyn Thompson, former ambassador to the Soviet Union, who knew a hell of a lot Khrushchev and the other Soviet leaders. And they did a deal. They had a quid pro quo. The quid was removing the missiles from Cuba, and the quo was removing U.S. missiles from Turkey. A sensible solution, and it happened. Okay. Now, U.S. intelligence was completely surprised that Khrushchev would dare try to put U.S. missiles in Cuba. And so U.S. intelligence missed it. I'm talking the CIA, okay? But then U.S. intelligence saw them. We had these great big U-2 aircraft with cameras, and we found them in Cuba. And we said, Mr. President, this is a strategic threat. And of course, Kennedy said, "You're right about that. What are we going to do about it?" Well, they figured out what to do. Okay. Well, as I said before, they did a little trade there, a little quid pro quo. The point is that we told the president, now President Kennedy, we're real happy that we found those missiles for you. Sorry we didn't tell you that they were coming before. We didn't continue to do that. But we assessed that those missiles, they don't have any nuclear warheads on them. We assessed that. We think that. Well, guess what? They had nuclear warheads on them.
Mm.
We didn't learn that for 3 decades. But then we learned that those things were ready to fire, okay? So my point is simply this, that the U.S. intelligence was partly right in finding these things. It was dead wrong in assessing, terrible word, assessing that they didn't have nuclear warheads on them, that they weren't ready to fire. So just think if Kennedy wasn't smart enough to listen to his diplomats rather than the crazy generals who wanted to launch a nuclear war against Russia and China at the same time. So what's the situation? Where's the analogy? Well, what I'm telling you is that these same kinds of missiles, medium range, shorter range ballistic missiles, are already now scheduled by the Pentagon to go into that anti-ballistic missile site in Romania and later in Poland. How do I know that? Well, Putin, in this little speech to Western journalists, says, look, we have the Pentagon plan. We know when these missiles will be replaced. And они знают, что мы знаем. And they know that we know. So this is brinksmanship at its worst, okay? So one reason why Putin wants to clean out those folks in Ukraine who are not very reliable, who have killed about 14,000, most people agree, people in the Donbass, most of them Russian speakers. He wants to clean that out because he sees an existential threat of the same kind that the U.S. faced back in 1962 in Cuba. And, you got to give the guy some credit for saying, look, these people won't listen to me. They don't take me seriously. I am responsible for defending Russia. And this is what I think we need to do. Now, before he did what he did in Ukraine, before he invaded Ukraine, he sought some backup, okay? Now, where did he get some backup? And this is perhaps the most important thing I'll say tonight. China. China is with Russia on this. Mm-hmm. And indeed, the way I reconstruct things, when Putin went up to begin or to launch with President Xi Jinping of China the Beijing Olympics, and that was February 4th of this year, I had a long talk with President Xi, and and they signed an agreement which says, our alliance not only exceeds the normal kind of alliance, but it has no limits. Okay, official declaration. And then, that's fact. Okay, that's all fact. Now I'm going to give you my speculation. Then Putin said, "Now, President Z, it's really nice that you call me your best friend, and it's nice that we've had 38 summits now for the last several years. We feel really close economically and militarily now. So I'm going to tell you something, and just tell you that the West is not listening to me. The U.S. and NATO are just going ahead with their plans in Ukraine. I think I may have to invade Ukraine."
Mm-hmm.
President Z. You mean after the Olympics, right? And Putin, oh yeah, after the Olympics. The day after the Olympics end, Putin recognizes Donetsk and Lugansk, the two Donbass oblast provinces that were heavily Russian speakers, and then 2 days later he invades Ukraine. How do the Chinese react? They say, we can understand why Russia did that. Will we condemn it? No, we won't condemn it. Will we vote against them in the UN? No, we won't. And besides that, even people that are competitors, as well as are people that live in the same part of Asia we do, the Indians, won't endorse it either, won't vote against. So you have, as a result of what's going on now, you have a tectonic shift in what the old Soviets used to call the world correlation of forces. Okay, it used to be East and West, used to be kind of the U.S. against Russia, NATO against Russia. Now it's the lily white West. Look at NATO. You see any people of color there?
Mm-mm.
Erdogan is as close as you get, I guess.
Yeah.
So you have the lily white West against the people that our media and our politicians have blackened the Russians to the point where they're people of color now for all intents and purposes. Mm-hmm. The Chinese, who happen to number 1.4 billion, and the Indians, and the South Africans, and the Brazilians, and the Saudi Arabians, for God's sake. You have a bipolar existence, a bipolar relationship again, in both senses of the term, bipolar, yeah. All right? It's the lily white West of NATO against the rest of the world. And guess what? To say that Russia is isolated in this situation is to speak nonsense. Mm-hmm. You have most of the world, as far as population is concerned, either defending or endorsing or at least acquiescing in what Putin has done. And, that's a big thing when you have the people of color against the lily white whites. It's a very unfortunate turn of events, but that's the new tectonic shift. That, in my view, is what's going to persist for the next several years, and that can only come to what the Chinese used to call a no good end.
Yeah, and NATO is also saying that India's actions for not wanting to choose a side is their silence is them siding with Russia, is what NATO says. The U.S. is also trying to pass a law to try to monitor Russia's interactions with all these African countries that aren't with NATO. But let me just show here for perspective what Ray was saying, like the geographical, how this is so strategic for NATO, showing you guys the map of Europe here, Finland, this massive border here, over 1,000 kilometers that it shares with Russia. In addition to Ukraine, right, which NATO wanted to make Ukraine a part of their membership. So adding on to that, with all the other members that they have as part of NATO. That it mirrors what Ray was talking about earlier about Russia installing weapons and wanting to install weapons in Cuba. Of course, the U.S. wanted to react to that and wanted to stop that. So, can you blame Russia for wanting to stop and prevent Finland and Sweden, as well as Ukraine, from joining NATO?
Mm-hmm.
All it could take.
Franco,
Yeah.
I just want to say, leave that map up if you could.
I will. Absolutely. I also have the map of what the Soviet Union looked like right before 1991. And prior to that, in World War I, how Finland was a part of Russia, as well as Poland was a part of Russia. So it's lost a lot of territory. I'll leave it up.
Yeah, I just want to comment on a little Russian history here that most people would not be aware of. If you look at Ukraine down there, I can point to it, but your folks couldn't see it. Can you put an arrow on Ukraine? Yeah. Okay. See that river in the middle there, right at right in the middle of Ukraine. That's Kiev. Okay. And there you go. Good. Now, what's special about Kiev? Well, that's where the first Slavic civilization was born. There were very enterprising Slavic peoples who lived there, and people from Norway, Sweden, Denmark came down to trade in Istanbul, which of course is to the east and south of Ukraine. And that river system, which is called the Dnieper River, was how they did it. Okay. Now there was a rich trade going on, and the princes of Kiev, Slavic princes of Kiev, were getting pretty rich, and the civilization was becoming pretty affluent. They had one problem. Although the Slavs were very talented people, although they had a very rich oral tradition, I mean, they had epic poems like the Iliad or the Odyssey, for God's sake. One is called Slovo o Polku Igorevye, a beautiful piece of literature. But guess what? It was not written down. Why was it not written down? Because they had no alphabet. Now, we're talking 8th, 9th century AD, or current era, whatever they call it now, okay, after AD. So what happened? Well, if you see Greece down there, Greece, some Greek priests came up from and went into Ukraine and lived with those people and said, these people are really, really smart people. They're nice and they're getting pretty wealthy. Let's construct an alphabet for them so that they can have a literature like everybody else in the world. And so that's what they did. These two Greek priests, Cyrus and Methodius, we're talking about 8th century now, 9th century. They go up to Kiev and they manufacture an alphabet, okay? They took all the Greek letters that fit the Slavic sounds, and then they knew Latin as well, and they put those ones in where they needed them, and they knew Hebrew, and they had a couple of things. You'll see some of the Cyrillic looks like Hebrew, and then they, for sounds like Shah, they had to construct manufacture a character, and they put the thing together, and all of a sudden there was a written literature. We're talking 9th century now, after Christ. What happened? Well, the church flourished. The church had a liturgy, a language that they used in the liturgy, and of course the civilization flourished. And when you get to be about the year 1100, Russia is the people in Kiev and the people north of there, and a little bit to the west, the Pripyat marshes, they're beginning to have a real civilization. And what happens? Okay, look at the map again. The Golden Hordes, the Zalotaya Iga, Genghis Khan and all those guys come in from the east. They subjugate Russia for 2 centuries and 20 years. So now, as the Western Europe is coming out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance, the Russians are still fighting off these hated Tatars, these hated Mongols, these people who were ruling them with an iron fist for 2 centuries and 20 years, okay? So they're behind the curve here. I mean, yeah, they got a language, but they're already 2 centuries behind. In a word, Russia has been playing catch-up ball ever since. But let's not leave it there. Let's go to the 14th, 15th century. Well, Russia's getting its act together. Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, actually, he's consolidating the Russian civilization into something like what we know now, except what happens? If you look there to the west of Russia, you have Lithuania, you have Poland, you have Germany, and guess what? The Poles, the Lithuanians, the Hanseatic League, which was part of Germany, that's just a little bit to the west of Poland there, they invade Russia. And so the Russians now have to fight off the invaders from the west, okay? And that took another century. Finally, Peter the Great comes into power in 1700 or thereabouts, and they're beginning to say, okay, now we can join the West again. We can, we're behind the 8 ball here a little bit, being 2 centuries behind. But Peter the Great, even though he's czar or about to be czar, he goes incognito to the Netherlands, and he works on the wharves of Rotterdam. Why? He wants to see what the West is really like, how they're governed, what the people are like. He comes back after 2 years, becomes complete czar, and says, "Okay, we're going to join the West now. No longer are we going to bother about these people in the East. We're Westerners. We got a language, we got a culture. We're going to join the West. I like the way," says Peter the Great, how they structure their society. Now, he went a little overboard, saying, okay, shave off your beards now, and, we're going to be really like the West. But he had the right idea. And I guess, would add right now that the most famous and best poet of the 19th century in Europe, his name was Alexander Pushkin, okay? And he wrote a poem about Peter the Great called Medny Vsadnik. It's the Bronze Horseman. And he has him looking toward the west, okay? And he has Peter the Great saying, "Отнюдь грозит мы будем шведу. Здесь будет город заложен, на змей нас медному соседу. Природой здесь нам суждено в Европу прорубить окно." Okay? Translation, from here, we're going to threaten Шведу, Sweden, the Hanseatic League, the Lithuanians. They're not going to give us any trouble anymore. We're going to threaten those folks. Here we're going to build a city, Petersburg. To the detriment of our hated neighbors. Природа здесь. By nature itself, it is preordained that we will, from this city, what's the word? Prorobit. We're going to knock through a window into Western Europe. В Европу, into Europe. Prorobit окно is a window. So that was what they did. And Peter had a pretty successful reign. Catherine the Great, later in that century, at the same time as we Americans were having our revolution, she spread Russian possessions all the way down to include Crimea and Russia's only all year round port. Now, why do I go through all this? Well, I go through all this because every Russian school person learns this history. They learn about the Tatars from the east or the Mongols from the east. They learn about the Lithuanians, the Poles, and the Hanseatic League from the west. And then, of course, they learn that when Russia finally gets its act together, Napoleon comes in from the west. Napoleon, okay? War and Peace sort of explains that whole war, okay? And then when they're finished with Napoleon, God help us, what happens? The Germans come in again from the west. Now, where did these guys come in from? Oh, a place called Ukraine. Oh, Ukraine. Well, the last war, which the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, we call World War II, the Russians had to contend with collaborators in Ukraine who joined the Nazis, who were a separate unit under the SS, who killed a lot of Russians and Poles and Jews and Hungarians, and were just pretty bad people. Now they have descendants, and they're very influential now in Ukrainian affairs, put in place by a coup that we in the West arranged. So getting back to the normal Russian, they look at Ukraine and say, oh, isn't that where Hitler came through? Yeah, that's where Hitler came through. Didn't we beat him? Yeah, we beat him. But what did it cost? I mean, maybe your listeners don't know what it cost, but it cost 26 million.
Yeah.
Million with an M, huh? People killed, Soviet people killed. Okay, now by comparison, the United States lost, well, I think 420,000, all of them soldiers. We're talking 26 million Russian citizens, not just the army. Now, you tend to remember something like that, right? And when you see Nazis or proto-Nazis or Nazi folks getting into position of heading up units in the Ukrainian armed forces, well, you don't have to play that up very much for every sentient Russian to say, oh my God, haven't we been through this before? And so when Putin says, as is true, that there's a Nazi influence in the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian government, I mean, this resonates with every Russian. And, you know, if you're looking for one reason why Putin enjoys I think the last count was 82% approval rating, it's because they know he's trying to clean Ukraine out of the Nazis, out of their military stature, and out of these potential places where NATO, the US, could put these little missiles that would endanger Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile force, which would be in range. And we talk about the time to target, 5-6 minutes again. So that's how the Russians look at it. Now, you won't get any of this from CNN or BSNBC. You know, they have something very different. And the reason for that is that for the military-industrial complex to flourish, you need an enemy. And Russia is chosen for now, but the big enemy is going to be China. The strategic, every 4 years, the Pentagon does a strategic planning document that was released a month ago. Enemy number one, China. Russia doesn't even make it to the top 4. We're going to take care of Russia, no problem. China is the big threat. Well, now this bespeaks a really dumb, what's the word? A kind of just a really dumb outlook on what's happening. Because as I tried to explain before, there's a shift, a tectonic shift in the balance of forces now. And now we have a triangular relationship between Russia, China, and the United States. Used to be sort of like an equilateral triangle, if you remember that from geometry. Now there are two, it's an isosceles triangle, okay? You got two long arms, Russia and China together, and then the US is literally on the short end of the stick or the short end of the triangle. And yet, these people that advise Biden have it in their heads that no, we are the indispensable, we are exceptional, and we're going to prevail. They're crazy. They're not going to prevail. They're going to take us all down with them unless we stop this uh, juggernaut that's rolling down the hill to war.
Yeah, given all that history, it should be obvious to Russians what it would mean for Ukraine and Finland and Sweden, all these countries that border it, to if they join NATO, how at risk they'll be from these outside forces, and history repeating itself and harming the citizens again. That's the most lives that were lost in World War II, was the Soviet Union lives. That's close to 30 million people that died. That's incredible. It's a lot more than what Americans lost, though. Here in America, they teach us World War II in a very patriotic way. It's the same in Russia. They teach to them in a patriotic way from a Russian perspective, but for them it meant a lot more because of all those lives that were lost. I wanted to,
let me. Well, you have the map up here. Maybe we can talk about how NATO expanded, or do you have a better map for that?
How NATO expanded. I can show you. So here's like pre-World War One, when Finland was a part of Russia, Poland was a part of Russia, Lithuania, Estonia. Then here is pre-1991, after World War II. Ukraine, Belarus, part of Russia. You want to look at this map?
Yeah, I think the first one is the best, the one that we had been looking at.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now, just for those in your audience that don't know about the promise that was made to actually President Gorbachev in 1990 not to expand NATO any farther east, let me explain what happened. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, okay? Now it fell apart. And all those countries in Eastern Europe were up in arms. The Poles and the Czechs and the Hungarians, and Moscow was losing its buffer zone. Moscow was losing the thing that it had been tacitly approved since World War II at Yalta, that they would exercise, they would have domain pretty much over a buffer zone, and that included Poland, Hungary, Romania, those places. So what happened? Well, George H.W. Bush, whom I knew really well, I worked for him when he was head of the CIA, and I also briefed him every morning when he was vice president. I was proud of what he did. When the Berlin Wall fell, he called up Mikhail Gorbachev, and he said, "Mikhail, sorry for your troubles. I want to just reassure you that we're not going to dance on the Berlin Wall. It's a terrible tragedy for you all. East Europe is falling apart, but we're not going to take advantage of it. We ought to get together. I mean, this is serious stuff. This hasn't happened since the war. How soon can you meet me?" And Gorbachev says, "Well, 3 weeks? Good. Let's meet in Malta, first week of December." And so they do. Again, and I know this because Jack Matlock, the ambassador to the Soviet Union, is a good friend of mine. We worked together back in the 70s doing arms control, and me in the CIA, he in the State Department. He told me, he says, "Yeah, so I was there in Malta, and what President Bush at that point said, look, we're not going to take advantage of it. We have to work out something. How soon can you see my Secretary of State, James Baker?" And Gorbachev turned to his foreign secretary or his foreign minister and said, "Shevardnadze, how about the first week Yeah, how about the first week of February? Okay, we'll do it. First week of February, James Baker, a really smart Texas lawyer, not the worst Secretary of State that we've had, working for George H.W. Bush, arrives in Moscow. 1st of February, okay? Talks to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and says, here's the deal. Now, we would like to have a reunited Germany. Now, I have to laugh because I didn't want a reunited Germany. Maybe I watched too many war films. Maybe it was because I was alive during all of World War II. But I knew darn well as a CIA analyst that the whole purpose of NATO, okay, the whole purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out of Europe, to keep the US in Europe, and to keep Germany divided. So they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it again. Okay, they've done it twice already in the 20th century. They don't want to do it again. So here's Gorbachev, and here's James Baker. I mean, Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, and Baker's saying, "Now it's going to be easy. We'll control it. It's going to be great." And they said, "No, that's a big. Do you know how many people we lost in World War II?" And Baker says, "No, how many? Well, 26 million. Oh, this is a bitter pill. We have to sleep on this." So they go. The next day they get together and they say, well, that's a pretty big quid you're asking of us. Reunited Germany, huh? Yeah, the place is falling apart, but a reunited Germany? Come on, give us a break. What's the quo? The quid pro quo. What are you going to give us in response or in compensation for allowing a reunited Germany? And Baker says, "Oh, that's no problem. How about this?" And I have this exactly from Jack Matlock, who was there, right? He says, Baker says, "How about?" He's got a Texas accent. I can't replicate that, but he says, "How about this?" He says, "Look, if you accept the reunited Germany, we promise not to move NATO 1 inch, a couple of centimeters closer to Russia, to the east." And Gorbachev, Shevardnadze say, "Oh God, that was it. So you promise that?" Baker says, "Cross my heart, hope to die. I promise." Okay. Now, he's a fancy Texas lawyer, right? He knows, as all lawyers do, you have to write something like that down. Shevardnadze, Gorbachev, they should have known better too, but they didn't insist on it, and so Baker slipped away without any written document guaranteeing that. We know it was promised. It's in all the notes. Jack Matlock attests to it. Helmut Kohl of Germany saw Gorbachev the next day, made the same promise. It was a promise. Now, there were 14 nations in NATO at the time. Guess what? Bill Clinton, because he thought maybe he'd win more Polish, Hungarian, East European votes in his contest with Bob Dole, said, let's let Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic into NATO. And his advisor said, no, we promised not to do that. And so Clinton's a lawyer. He says, "Oh, show me the document." Well, it was a promise, but it wasn't written down. "Oh, it was written down." Well, screw it. This is going to really help me in the election. Now, again, this is not McGovern making this up. Jack Matlock testified to Congress when all this was going on and said this was be a terrible, terrible mistake. Terrible mistake. We'll have to pay the price of it in coming years. And he swore up and down, "Please don't do this." And after it was all over, some of these congressional aides came up to Ambassador Matlock and said, "Now, Mr. Ambassador, we agree with you. This is a terrible mistake, but the Russians can't do anything about it now. We need the votes. It all has to do with the election coming up. Bill Clinton has decided. So no matter what you say or George Kennan says or any Soviet expert says, yeah, it's going to go through. So just know that. Go have a drink. Forget about it. Okay. So that's the way it went down. So that was, I'm looking at your map here. Look at Poland. Look at Hungary. Look at the Czech Republic. Those were the first three. There were a couple other tranches of new members. Suffice it to say that those Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovenia, they all ended up in NATO. It doubled in size. Now there are 30. I told you there were 14. I guess it was 15 when Baker made that promise. So, I had a chance to talk to one of Gorbachev's aides. This was about 7 years ago. I was in Moscow consulting with some of them. And his name was Kuvaldin. He's a professor now at one of the prestigious Moscow universities. And I took him aside and I said, why was that agreement not written down? I can't understand why. The main promise, German reunification and no eastward movement. Why didn't you get it written down? And he looked at me. Then he was ready for this. He had been asked this before, I could tell. He says, well, there were two small reasons. One is that we hadn't really gotten German buy-in on this. We're talking about a reunited Germany. We had to consult both the East guys and the West guys. And again, I had to tell them about this. So it's a little premature to write it down. And the other thing is the Warsaw Pact, the NATO counterweight, or the alliance that the Russian, that still existed. So you're talking about Warsaw Pact. So, but then he looked me in the eye and he said, but Mr. McGovern, the main reason that we didn't write it down is because we trusted you. Wow. Well, suffice it to say, today there is no trust. We have reneged on a lot of things. And maybe I come from the Bronx in New York, and we talk about, give me a for instance, give me a for instance. I'm going to give you a for instance on something very recent that I think Joe Biden reneged on. Here it is. At the end of last year, Biden and Putin had a conversation, Zoom, I guess it was, some kind of technical conversation on the 7th of December. And they agreed to launch a negotiating process which would address Russian concerns about this existential threat from NATO in Ukraine. Okay? Now, that was scheduled to begin on the 12th of January this year. All of a sudden, Putin calls Biden and says, no, we have to talk before that. I need to talk to you before the end of the year. So on the 30th of December, they have this telephone talk. What did they talk about? What did Putin want? Well, the U.S. readout from that telephone talk, and it lasted quite a while, it was not much. They didn't say anything, okay? The Russian readout said, Joseph Biden assured President Putin that the U.S., quote, the U.S. has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. U.S. has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. Now, that's big. The Russians made a big deal of it. No mention over here in the United States, no mention from the White House. What are we talking about? We're talking about Joe Biden saying, okay, all right, we won't put any missiles like we have in Poland, like we have in Romania. We're not going to put any in Ukraine. That would get the negotiations off to a good start. And Putin, okay. Now, what happened? When they got to Geneva, we said, forget about it. Yeah, it disappeared. So you talk about trust, huh? I don't know how to explain what happened to that. And I really haven't had a chance to check with my Russian analyst colleagues. But to have a major concession made by the President of the United States personally, directly on the telephone with the President of Russia, and then have that sort of peter away and not be a matter of the negotiation, something smells in not only in Denmark on that one. So if you put yourself in the position of Putin and you think you have extracted a promise, ooh, talking about promises again, huh? No, not written down promises. Oh, wow. You know, the degree of trust is very minimal, and when it played out in such a way that and other things showed Putin, I'm sure, that the U.S. and NATO still didn't get it about Ukraine. And then that's when he went to his friend Xi in China and said, I think I'm going to have to use military force. Now, let me just add this, because there may be some Chinese experts in the audience here, or people who know the history of China and the recent history of China. China has one principled foreign policy stance, and that is the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, okay? You don't invade other countries. That treaty ended the 30 Years' War, where Protestants and Catholics were killing each other off for 30 years, for God's sake. And they said, no, don't interfere in other countries. So that's the Westphalian example. The Chinese were devoted to that. They always said, our bedrock principle is no interference in the affairs of other countries. And so when I suggested to my Chinese analyst colleagues that President Xi, might approve of Putin invading Ukraine, no, never do that, okay? Well, okay, they may be right, but the evidence since then suggests very strongly that if he didn't say, yeah, you go ahead, lad, he just said, you mean after the Olympics, right? Okay. Because ever since then, the Chinese have changed their rhetoric on this position. Okay. It's no longer citing Westphalia. What they say first is, we address every specific situation like this on its merits, and then we decide the appropriate answer. Now, this is not just rhetoric. Okay. They said this to President Xi, said this to President Biden. Xi said this to the head of the EU. Xi said this to the head of the EU Commission. So it's really kind of the new codification of where China stands on this non-interference proposition. And I'm talking not so much as a Chinese expert, but as somebody who's witnessed the change in China's attitude. Now they say, we will judge each situation based on its own merits. And that's a big change in rhetoric. We used to do a lot of interpretation of rhetoric coming from Chinese, and especially from communist nations. It really means something, and you can derive real profound conclusions from it. That's my conclusion. Again, not all my Chinese analysts agree. Most of them don't. But Xi seems to have thrown his weight behind Putin. And why? Well, it's not so much that, they're best friends.
They know they're
Xi
next.
knows. Yeah, right. Xi knows they're next. So maybe I'll stop there for a while and let you get a couple words in edgewise.
I wanted to get your thoughts on this clip that I found in this interview by former U.S. Colonel Richard Black. He's pretty much saying a lot of things that you would agree with, how we're maybe sleepwalking into World War III. And I wanted to ask you two questions about this. So let's first listen to what he has to say, and then I'll ask you the questions.
Sure.
So hate any Christian that they would go out and slaughter them, and they did with the Russians. It was a very bloody war for Russia. In the end, the Central Intelligence Agency was fielding a terrorist army of 300,000 members, largest terrorist army in modern history. When it was over, they sent a message from Afghanistan to CIA and back. There was some cryptic comment to the extent, "We did it." And I think at that point, they began to recognize that it is much better to have proxies fight than to get the American people to agree to fight these wars. So we have done that repeatedly. We did it throughout much of the Middle East, although we've also put troops on the ground. We are using the Ukrainians for the time being as proxies, but I think there is now a movement, and this goes back to what Harley was saying. We potentially face an economic cataclysm in the United States. We have printed such vast quantities of unbacked currency that inflation is inevitable. We're seeing it now. But what we're just seeing our toe dipped into the water. We're about to go into the pool, and we're going to see inflation that will make us long for the days of Jimmy Carter. And I think to some extent, there's an element within the Democratic Party, since they're in power today, that would say that here's a chance to wag the dog. They did it successfully when they attacked Serbia. When the U.S. attacked Serbia on the eve of the Bill Clinton impeachment trial in the Senate, where we attacked Serbia to their utter amazement, because they had been longtime allies of the U.S. and suddenly we had jets dropping bombs from the sky. So I think there is an element within the Democratic Party that says we are faced with the worst election imaginable in November. Perhaps there's a chance, if we can distract the American people by talk of war and mobilization and all of the hysteria and excitement that goes with war, maybe we can divert their attention. So, but we have this long running move towards the border of Russia. And I always talk about the boys from Davos. We have these oligarchs from all around the world. There are a couple of thousand of them. They meet once or twice a year in Davos, Switzerland. And they basically plot out the future of the world. What are we going to do? Where are we going to have wars? Where are we going to have peace? How will we change the energy system of the world? So it's not necessarily Americans who make all the decisions, but it certainly is not the American people. And the American people desperately need to get back into the game and have a voice.
So there's a lot of truth that he was saying there about where this will lead to, the inflation, and he brought up Davos. He's alluding to the World Economic Forum, where a lot of these global leaders meet and they do discuss like how they can expand more capitalism and empower some of these leaders, the energy sector and everything. I wanted to ask you two things here. Why is it that some people who worked in the military or who worked in intelligence, why is it that they speak out sometimes after they retire? And are you familiar with these meetings that some of these leaders have in Davos and the World Economic Forum? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, let me say a word first about Dick Black, who happens to be a friend of mine, and who actually is part of our Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, signed on to our recent memo to the president. You saw the Marine flag behind him. Mm-hmm. You saw the U.S. Army flag behind him. You saw the U.S. flag. He served as a Marine officer in Vietnam. He uh, later became a lawyer and served in the highest part of the Judge Advocate General setup in the U.S. Army. And more recently, he has been a state senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I used to live. So he's got experience coming out his ears, and he feels free to speak because these are parlous times. And these are times that require people to take off the gloves and say what they know. Now, I was intrigued by what he said about Wag the dog.
Mhm.
Your audience probably knows Wag the dog. Among other things, Clinton did was when his dalliance with, what was it, Monica Lewinsky was discovered. If memory serves, it's then that he shot some Tomahawk missiles into Sudan of all places, saying that there was a biological weapon. Come on, anyway, it's succeeded in diverting attention for a while. If you look at how Reagan and Weinberger were so embarrassed by the killing of those 242 Marines in Beirut, and what they do? Well, they did a little invasion of Grenada, saying that there was a communist threat in Grenada. So you can use these things to wag the dog. Now, I am afraid that Dick Black is right on target there in worrying about this, because if you look at Joe Biden, it's not only inflation, and after all, it's the economy, stupid, right? That's what's going to really turn the midterm into what most people think will be a debacle for the Democrats. So it's the economy, but it's also some very, very embarrassing things for Joe Biden personally. And I want to refer, in this case, to his son, Hunter. We have the laptop now acknowledged as very, very authentic. We know that Joe Biden himself is scheduled to get payoffs, get 10% of this, 10% of that with the Chinese, with others. We know that there are all kinds of other very embarrassing things to come out of that laptop. Now, that was suppressed. It was a miracle that the Democrats were able to suppress that for a whole month before the election, but they did. I mean, the New York Post was the first newspaper. They took it off Twitter or took it off. It was amazing. Censorship for that whole. When George Stephanopoulos interviewed Biden in one of the little debates, he never asked him about this. Okay, so it was so flagrant. Would it have changed the results of the election? I don't know, but there it is. Okay, so that's coming out now. Both the Times and the Washington Post have admitted, oh yeah, we were fooled. How were we fooled? Oh well, there were those 51 intelligence leaders who all said it sounded like the Russians to them, sounded like the Russians. Give me a break. I know some of the guys that signed on to that thing, and I know others, and they should be embarrassed to have been enlisted in that kind of thing. It wasn't the Russians. It was authentic Hunter Biden. Now, what else? Well, Biden is susceptible of being exposed in other things. One is Russiagate. Now, many of your audience may still believe that the Russians tried to affect the 2016 election, 2020 as well. And many have been persuaded by the media that we talked about before that who's responsible for 4 years of Donald Trump? The Russians. Now, my wife always tells me, Ray, when you go on one of these interviews, always make it clear what you think of Donald Trump. So I will. I think he was the very worst president the United States ever had, and that's saying something, okay? But was he right about Russiagate? He's dead right. And that's coming out now in court. Okay. So what I'm saying here is that Joe Biden was with that group in January of 2017 that approved the use of this dossier manufactured by people working for the Democratic National Committee and all these kinds of things to blacken Trump. And even before the election, Hillary Clinton had these well-heeled, fancy lawyers, Michael Sussman among them. Michael Sussman is being tried this week as we speak. What did he do? He lied to the FBI. He tried to make the case that there was a bank in Russia, the Alpha Bank, with which the Trump crowd had a sinister relationship. How do we know all about that? Well, the emails have come out in court proceedings. It's very clear that they manufactured this out of whole cloth, that is, the ties with Alpha Bank before the election, and they manufactured the Russian hacking out of whole cloth. And we have the head of CrowdStrike, the cyber firm that investigated the Russian hacking, saying under oath in December of 2017, there was no technical evidence that those DNC emails so prejudicial to Hillary Clinton were hacked. Not by the Russians, not by anybody. They were not hacked, okay? That's what our technical forensic examination reveals. We think the Russians still did it, but we have no evidence, okay? So what I'm saying here is that Democrats, to the degree all this comes out, and to the degree that Joe Biden's involvement in those key meetings, he was fully cognizant of all this, plus the Hunter Biden stuff. That the last thing that I'll mention is equally damning, maybe damning most of all. Most people don't realize that Biden was in on the coup in Kiev in Ukraine in 2014, okay? He was the vice president at the time. Now, how do I know that? Well, it's in an intercepted conversation between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador in Kiev. And what are they saying? They are plotting the coup. They are picking the next prime minister. His name is Yatsenyuk. They're saying, oh no, these Nazis, you put them in subordinate positions. That would not go over well. And then finally, the ambassador, our ambassador in Kiev said, but Secretary Nuland, what's the European Union going to say about this? What's the EU? They're not going to like that we orchestrate this coup. And she says, F, uses the F word. That's 4 letters. F the EU. Okay. Then at the very end, Nuland says, now the best news is that once we get this thing going, I talked to Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan was National Security Assistant to Vice President Biden. What's he doing now? Oh, now he's National Security Assistant to President Biden. So Nuland says in this conversation, I talked to Jake Sullivan. He says Biden's on. He's good. We need an important international personage to come in and glue this thing together to make it stick. As soon as we get the coup going, Biden's good to do that. Now, that's not a secret. That's an authentic intercepted conversation. It was intercepted before the coup. It ran on YouTube 18 days before the coup. And when it ran on YouTube, Victoria Nuland apologized to the EU. She said, oh, I'm sorry, I said F the EU. So we know the conversation is authentic. What am I saying here? I'm saying here that Joe Biden, everyone knows who is aware of this intercepted conversation. It was en clair. It was not encrypted. Russia, I don't know, anybody can intercept a question like that and put it on YouTube. So Biden was in on it. So was Jake Sullivan. And now they're in positions of great power. So the Russians know that. The Americans don't necessarily know that. But to the degree that there's ammunition out there for the Republicans or anybody who wants to do the Democrats in the midterms, well, it's all available. And it's not going to work the way it worked last time. Last thing I'll say on this is that the midterms in 2018, I'm sorry, in 2018, we needed Mueller to have the lingering suspicion that Trump was in cahoots with the Russians, right? So even though we knew in December of 2017, as I already mentioned, that there was no technical evidence that there was a Russian hack, Mueller put that in his report and prolonged his investigation that was no longer necessary, prolonged it past the midterms, okay? I missed that at the time. I was wondering what's taking them so long. I mean, there's no evidence there. He finally came out and said, yeah, there's no evidence, although he continued to speculate that the Russians hacked the DNC. But the whole idea was to let it go through the midterms, let the Democrats win really big by holding Trump under suspicion of collaborating with the Russians. And that worked like a charm. So what's going to happen this time with the midterms coming up? They're really important midterms. I guess that's all I'll say about that. But when you look at these things, we in America realize that you have to look through a domestic political prism. And we're not alone in that, because the head of Russia, a fellow named Putin, has said time and time again that U.S. foreign policy is hostage. His word is hostage to internal political developments within the United States, and that explains a lot of the otherwise unexplainable things that the United States does. Will there be a false flag? Will there be a wag the dog? Well, I think it's. I think we have to be alert for it, because the conditions are ripe, as we would say, and Biden is going to need some Deus ex machina, some God from the skies to descend now and help the Democratic Party in November, especially because, as you started out saying, the economy is not looking good. Inflation is looking high. And then there's all these other things where Biden is vulnerable on and might want to, in his, if he's fully compos mentis, I'm not sure, but he might be persuaded to approve one of these wag the dog operations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, are you familiar with the meetings that some of these leaders have in Davos and the World Economic Forum?
I know what I read in the New York Times and Washington Post and other things. I know that they're the movers and shakers, and that many believe that they pretty much influence the banks and everything else. And I'm sure that's true, but this is not my specialty.
I see. Yeah. What are your views now on electoral politics? Do you think that it serves in any way to improve the situations around the world? Is there such thing as harm reduction when it comes to voting, in your opinion?
I guess I'd have to punt on that one.
Okay.
My expertise is foreign affairs, and specifically Russia, Europe, China. I just would hesitate to comment on the question you just asked me.
Okay. Yeah. So Ray McGovern, thank you very much. For everything
that welcome,
all the information you provided us with. A lot of valuable history information here, because we know our education system does such an amazing job in educating the U.S. about its history and Russia's history and everything, right? But I really appreciate you coming on, Ray McGovern. That was a really great discussion. Is there any final message you'd like to leave the people with?
Yeah, I think we need to spread the truth around. One of my favorite prophets really was Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In all the courses I teach, I always weave in by some stratagem his famous letter from the Birmingham City Jail. And I have one little passage from that not many people are familiar with. And it pretty much describes what I've set up as what I do for the rest of the time I have around here. He's talking about justice, and he's talking about injustice. And what Dr. King says is this: like a boil that can never be cured unless it is opened up with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, so too injustice must be exposed with all the friction its exposure creates to the air of national opinion and public conscience before it can be cured. And so that's our job. We've got to expose injustice. We've got to expose lies. The truth will set us free. I like what Julian Assange says: in the final analysis, the truth will win. Now, just as a last comment, my son, who runs my website, will always ask me after every interview, and I'll probably put this one up on my website, Dad, did you tell him about our website? And if I don't mention that McGovern.com is our website, he gets sort of angry and frustrated because he puts a lot of work into our website. So it's McGovern.com. And what my son always says: Dad, when you mention that, always add this. If you don't get it, you don't get it. So at the risk of seeming outlandish here, everything I write, most of what I do in interviews and in speeches, is to be found on RayMcGovern.com. So anybody interested in following me, just tune in. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So I'm easy to find. Look me up and ask me questions if you like. I appreciate your opportunity to let me hold forth here, Franco. I hope that the history lessons were well received and maybe even well needed. And maybe I'll talk to you again sometime.
Absolutely. And remember, everyone, share this interview as far and wide. We really need people to be more informed about what's happening in the world. And Ray McGovern, again, thank you very much for coming on the show. And to everybody else, stay informed.